Storytelling has always been important in Mortal Kombat. Anyone who tells you otherwise is as brainless as victims of Baraka's food for thought fatality, or they're lying to you. From tie-in comics for the first two games by series co-creator John Tobias, to character-centric spin-off games, to a tutorial mode with character history delivered via text, to a tutorial mode expanded into a prequel story that fleshes out the universe, to a not as well done adventure mode centered on a single character, to the modern cinematic story mode that set the standard for the rest of the fighting genre to imitate and in many cases surpass. Unfortunately, while being an undeniable trendsetter with their story modes, Netherrealm Studios never really bothered to properly iterate upon the formula. They have acted basically like they sit on top of the mountain as kings of the castle with no real opposition to their throne. But others have come along, recognised the flaws of Netherrealm's formula and avoided them. Meanwhile, people continue to obliviously praise Netherrealm's take, thereby allowing them to grow complacent, leading to an entry released over 10 years after the first one, with barely any improvements and many of the progenitor's flaws being exacerbated. So how did we get here? How was Netherrealm's story structure changed since Midway's Swansong, and what can they do to improve it post MK11? Let's go back to the beginning and find out. 2008's Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe is where this all started. The game offers two perspectives for the player to follow. Each story is divided into chapters, 7 for MK, 8 for DC, since one of MK's got cut. Each following a specific character for 4 fights, with the exception of Green Lantern, who is only given 3 for some reason. According to Ed Boon, this was done to allow the player to familiarise themselves with one character at a time, rather than switching around between characters before they get a good grasp on the one they were playing as. As a first attempt, this works well enough, but there are clear limitations brought about by this system. First of all, characters rarely win fights outside of those the player takes part in, resulting in the characters having a solid 4-fight run, with usually every fight before and after that point being a loss. This issue is made worse by the fact that not everyone gets to be played as, leaving Kano, Kitana, Baraka, Catwoman and Deathstroke with 0 wins between them. Additionally, the strict adherence to 4 fights per character, when chapters rarely have enough material between their start and end points to justify 4 entire fights, often leads to the writers having to contrive justifications for additional fights. These two issues are justifiable in DCU thanks to 2 specific plot points. The powers of the cast fluctuating over the course of the story, as showcased by Liu Kang and Batman defeating their respective rivals early on and then losing to them towards the end, justifies the chapters, as the character's win streak is the result of the power fluctuation favouring them at that time. Meanwhile, the filler fights are usually the result of the combat rage overtaking a character, thereby justifying Sonya fighting Jax or Superman fighting Batman. These issues would become far more significant in the Netherrealm era. Speaking of which, 2011's Mortal Kombat kickstarted the Netherrealm era with its take on DCU's story mode. Rather than dividing the story into separate campaigns, the story is a single narrative told over 16 chapters, unofficially divided into 3 acts based on the 3 games it's retelling. Again, it's divided into chapters of 4 fights per character, with the closing chapter of each act featuring 5. With 29 unique fightable characters on the base roster including NPCs, and only 16 chapters in the story, 2 utilising the same character, this leaves 14 characters, half the roster, without a playable story role. While we get to fight every character at least once to give everyone at least 1 loss, very few of those we don't play as ever get to win a fight. Of particular note, the only times a villain is played as are for Scorpion and Cyrax's chapters, and they spend most of their chapters closer to neutral than evil. A result of this is that the villains can't be taken seriously as threats, as even the big bad Emperor himself and previously canonical top tier fighters like Goro, Bihan and Ermac either cannot pull out a single victory or can only do so in a cut scene. It's damaging for certain plot points as well, such as the Cyber Initiative making characters objectively worse fighters, with Sector going from a 0-2 win-loss ratio to 0-3, and Cyrax going from 4-1 to 0-2. This is not helped by the fact alluded to earlier that, while it's with 2 different movesets, Sub-Zero is given 2 chapters to himself, not 1 for each brother mind, and Liu Kang is given the 5th fight of Kung Lao's chapter in addition to his own 5-fight chapter. Both of these issues would become worse over time. Additionally, adherence to the character chapters leads to a bizarre power imbalance. For example, after his 4-win streak at the start of the game, Johnny Cage never wins again, losing progressively harder and harder, from gameplay loss to cutscene loss to cutscene 1-hit loss. Without the power fluctuation from DCU, there is no justification for this, and it just comes off as a major contrivance. Additionally, the lack of combat rage also leads to a ton of contrived fights to pad for time. Chapters typically only have 2 fights of relevance to open and close the chapter. Everything between point A and B tends to be pure filler. Jax has a tournament bout, then heads off to save Sonya, defeating Shiva to do so. In between those points, his group gets lost in the armory, where Johnny annoys Jax into a frenzy, and then Jade just happens to find them. Those fights and the cutscene budget could easily have gone towards another character to let them show off what they can do and flesh out some of the background plots, like the monks saving their Shaolin masters, or making the invasion feel larger in scale than a small incident isolated to 3 locations and about 12 players. One last thing to discuss is that prior to MK11, each Netherrealm story mode had some kind of gimmick to shake things up. For 2011, it was handicap matches. The player is never given a tag partner despite the mechanic existing for arcade mode, and player characters usually being accompanied by at least one ally, but the CPU often is, leading to some pretty bullshit fights that really only serve to increase the number of losses among the cast and make them look even more pathetic. 2013 brought this story structure to the DC universe proper in Injustice Gods Among Us. This game maintains the same chapter system but without the 3 acts marked by 5 fight chapters, and a mere 12 chapters overall, which would become the standard from here on out. Each character is fought against twice, with the exception of Superman and Doomsday, who are fought only once each, and Wonder Woman, who is fought thrice. Once again, not everyone is playable, with 24 base roster characters. That doesn't sound too bad though, right? That just means a paltry half the cast isn't playable. Actually, no. See, the story revolves around 2 universes. Every character on the roster has a counterpart in the other universe, with the exceptions of the Joker and Green Arrow, whose counterparts are already dead, and Dick Grayson, who is substituted for Damian Wayne. This brings the total character count up to 46. So that means 12 of 46? Yes, but it's worse than it sounds. Batman gets 2 chapters, because Batman. Each Batman is playable in his own dedicated chapter, in addition to a mirror match at the end of Wonder Woman's chapter. Story-wise, that's 12. Gameplay-wise, it's 11. Now, if we're generous and only count the characters who take part in playable fights and aren't just cutscene cameos, that leaves us with 12 out of 33 proper fighters who manage to secure a win. And members of the Big Bad Regime only win when they turn against it. This really does show how difficult it is to take the threat seriously in Netherrealm stories. This game is also where I first noticed that the player is always on the left side of the screen, forcing cutscenes to be choreographed in such a way as to move the characters to the appropriate sides before the fight starts. I'll grant that this is an improvement over DCU, where they just jarringly teleport between shots, but once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. The gimmick this time is minigames that range from blocking bullets to murdering innocent civilians. Failure in these minigames results in the player starting the fight with reduced health, a la Soul Calibur 3's QTEs. It's a decent feature that allows for some more cinematic moments that are actually interactive with real consequences for failure. The only thing I would say is an actual improvement over 2011 is that cutscenes are finally skippable and the player can freely skip to any cutscene or fight from the menu. That's a fantastic addition. In 2015, Mortal Kombat X released. Same 12 character chapters, but no one is given more than the standard 4 fights this time. Again, we have 12 of 24 base roster characters getting victories. Goro is the pre-order DLC character and has no story role at all. Meanwhile, Baraka, Tanya, Rain and Sindel are fightable but not playable. So, discounting NPCs who don't fight in gameplay, 12 of 28 characters get wins, everyone gets at least 1 loss, with it being heroes who only lose once and villains that lose twice. Even a fallen Elder God can't secure a win beyond some impressive hand-to-hand skills in a cutscene. To help alleviate the issue of forced conflict, numerous chapters feature flashbacks to past events to allow the characters to have conflicts from a wider range of time periods. Placed into chronological order, this could have made the story feel less rigid, but it's fine as it is. The flashbacks also allowed them to make use of the new variation system, as the characters often use different variations between different time periods. Sadly, this is the extent of the system's use, as we never have characters change variations during a scene. Imagine if Jax had started in heavy weapons only to lose those weapons after a couple of fights, or if he picked them up from a dead comrade partway through. An oddity exclusive to this game is that the cutscenes and fights often don't take place in the same locations, having the fighters teleport to the arenas and back again, and not with actual in-story teleportations. Presumably this was to avoid all the scenes happening in the same few locations, but unless you're willing to go for a larger stage selection, this just isn't an issue you can work around. Finally, this game's gimmick is QuickTime events. Again, they allow for interactive cinematic moments, but there is no downside at all for failing them. You can let Kano beat the shit out of Kotal Khan, but Kotal will still start with full health. There are zero consequences to these moments, so it's easy to see why they got the axe. They could have used them to allow characters you don't play as to get some real action, but sadly not. 2017's Injustice 2 was the first to feel like any kind of evolution of the formula. Again, we have 12 chapters, though technically 13. Some chapters are joint chapters shared by two characters that the player can freely select for each fight, with a couple of exceptions. This system then sees use in the story's climax, where the player can choose between Superman and Batman for chapter 12. This is the only instance of the player's choice influencing the opponents they fight. Normally, the scene goes like this. Your characters enter an area where two opponents await. You choose who fights the first character while your partner fights the other. Rather than immediately moving into the next fight as the other character taking place at the same time, they regroup with your character after the first fight and the player chooses again. This really deflates the impact of whatever the other character was doing, as they will only occasionally beat some minions or, in a single instance, deadshot. It may have been better to bring back tag matches for this, but I'm willing to let this slide as it was the first attempt at this system. What I refuse to let slide, however, is the horrendous imbalance in character usage. Some characters get 4 fights to themselves, some split them with a partner, others get multiple chapters. Chapter 1 is Batman. Chapter 11 is Batman and Superman, with 3 fights the player chooses a character for and 2 where they are forced to use each character. Then Chapter 12 has the player choose between the 2 for the next 4 fights. Superman has a potential 8 fights. Batman has 12, and there are no variations in his moveset to my knowledge. That is fucking ridiculous. Some characters get 1 chapter and achieve nothing at all throughout it. Others don't get to be played as at all. Meanwhile, the already obnoxiously overused Batman gets 3 times as many fights as the average character. Another addition to this story mode was the Premier Skins, costumes that turn characters into other characters. At launch, there were 4 of these available: Power Girl, John Stewart, Reverse Flash, and Grid. Only the latter 2 actually saw use in the story. They should have chosen the launch skins based on what they could use in the story instead. As is, only 2 show up and one of them only appears once, just like Joker and Atrocitus. In total, the story has 28 base roster characters and 2 Premier Skins, leaving 2 skins and pre-order character Darkseid out entirely. Across the 12/13 chapters, 15 of 28 characters get to achieve a victory. Had we avoided repeat chapters, even without any more tag chapters, we could have brought this up to 18, giving us only around a third of the cast not getting any wins. And maybe the central antagonist could have actually won a fight for once. And finally, in 2019, Mortal Kombat 11 released. This game brings nothing new to the table for its story mode. No new gimmicks unless loss-based alternate endings count, and nothing to help cut down on contrivances. Due to the time travel plot, the base roster of 25 plus Kronika becomes 41. Across 12 chapters, only 14 characters are playable. 2 of them are Scorpion, and one of them is butting in on Sub-Zero's chapter, and then Liu Kang is playable again with a handful of altered moves. 27 characters, almost double the number of playable story characters, never win a fight. Even an Elder God, a man who controls time, the corrupted champion of Mortal Kombat, and the Titan of Time can't win a fight. Even with character chapters, there's no reason we couldn't have had more characters sharing with their counterparts like Scorpion did. Characters like Kano, Kabal, and Eren have counterparts, but neither version ever wins. This issue, which started small in DCU, has ballooned until more than half the goddamn characters are complete jokes. But at least the pre-order character is actually in the story this time, even if he never wins a fight. These issues only get worse when you zero in on the newcomers. 2011 had no newcomers in the story unless you count Cyber Sub-Zero, and Injustice is based on established characters. I could discuss how useful roster additions in Injustice 2 are, but let's focus on just brand new original characters that need a good showing of their combat prowess to win over fans. MKX has 8 new characters. 6 of them are playable in the story: Cassie Cage, Jackie Briggs, Kung Jin, Takeda, Kotal Khan, and Devora. Eren Black and Ferritor don't get to win, but that's only a quarter of the newcomers, so it can be forgiven. In MK11, however, we have just 4 newcomers: Kronika, Cetrion, Geras, and Collector. Since all 4 are villains, not one of them ever wins a fight, unless one counts Geras freezing the 2 monks after losing to them, but that's like saying Batman still beat Joker in their second DCU fight. Not only are 3 of these characters supposed to be incredibly powerful, they're also the central antagonists. How am I supposed to take these chumps seriously when they can't win a single fight between them. Yes, Cetrion's opponents always have some kind of power up to justify their wins, but Geras and Kronika's power over time is fucking useless. This is how bad the issue of no villain wins has gotten. People with power over time itself still lose every fight they have, even without the heroes having to play it smart and use tactics. You cannot deny that this total defanging of such powerful antagonists is objectively bad storytelling. Another issue with this style of story mode is that it generally narrows the story down to maybe 2 or 3 narratives going on at once. The Prime League investigates this other Earth while Prime Joker teams up with Regime Harley, the latter being put on hold for a while between Joker's capture and release. The Combat Kids deal with the Outworld Civil War while the old heroes fight with the Netherrealmers until Devora's betrayal merges the 2 plot lines. Raiden is trying to deal with the Time Merger while the ninjas and special forces fight the Lin Kuei and Black Dragon, and the other heroes work to depose Shao Kahn. But you go back to the 3D era, and outside of Armageddon, characters had their own personal goals, motivations and allegiances, and could be spread far and wide across the setting. In Deadly Alliance you had Raiden leading a group of heroes to fight the titular alliance, but you also had Nitara, Cyrax and Reptile taking part in a plot that had nothing at all to do with any of that. Kenshi, while connected to Cyrax and Jackson Sonya, was off doing his own thing instead of taking part in either group's narrative. Li Mei was in a tournament no one else was. Scorpion was hunting Quan Chi while the 2 Oni that opposed him were working for Shang Tsung. The sorcerers had separate lists of allies with varying goals and rivalries amongst themselves. In Deception, Shujinko, Nightwolf and Scorpion were the only characters whose main goal was to kill Onaga, but none of them were working together. Raiden was hunting Shujinko and was implied to have revived Liu Kang's corpse, which was confirmed later. Liu Kang and Ermac and Sindel and Jade had the goal of saving the mind-controlled heroes, but they operated separately. Hotaru was working for Onaga while also dealing with the Seidan Civil War against Darius and Dairu. Kenshi and Sub-Zero were trying to survive while being hunted by Hotaru. Bo Raicho and Li Mei were leading Katana's armies, unwittingly being manipulated by Melina. Cabal's Black Dragon were helping Havoc since he had saved Cabal's life. Noob was starting up his own faction with Smoke while Astra was hunting him. Everyone else was working for Onaga for their own reasons. And that's before the GameCube and PSP roster editions. Nowadays everyone is just boiled down to their faction and rarely gets any story of their own that isn't an iconic rivalry. Let's take a minute to look at a few other fighting games that took inspiration from Netherrealm's efforts and see how the competition has been doing. I've gotten flack before for saying that Street Fighter V story mode is far superior to Netherrealm's, but it's true. Sure, the story sucks, but that's just Capcom being true to their inspiration. What I was talking about was the structure. There are no character chapters. Characters are chosen on a fight-by-fight basis because the game trusts the player to be able to adapt. Plus, if you've played a previous entry, you have a decent idea how most of the cast plays, unlike MK, which revamps the cast moveset for no reason every time. Almost everyone is played as and fought against at least once, allowing almost everyone to get at least 1 win and 1 loss. This includes the villains, allowing them to be shown as real threats. M. Bison defeats Chun-Li, Charlie and Nikali, 3 of the most powerful characters in the setting, which does a marvellous job of setting him up as a real threat. The player is often placed on the right side as well, based on where the characters are standing in the cutscenes. This does cause the issue that the player isn't given sufficient warning before the fight starts, but implementing Netherrealm's transitional zooms with focus on who the player is using would instantly fix this. Additionally, the cutscenes are rendered in real time, which, while no longer being able to cover load screens and thus slowing the pace of the narrative some, does allow the player to swap out costumes in the story, which is great for players who indulge in DLC costumes. You'd think this is something Netherrealm would try with their recent push for customization. The game also has short, non-cinematic stories for the entire cast to help flesh out the events that happen around the main campaign, as well as giving DLC characters a place in the narrative. Overall, a huge step in the right direction. Soul Calibur 6 has a main story centered on a handful of main characters, while also giving every character their own non-cinematic story that achieves what SF5s do, but also including a non-canon one for guest fighter Geralt, because having the characters actually interact in a narrative is the entire point of a crossover, but they should never be canonical if they're owned by another company. It's like an Arc System Works story, but without the novel-length text narration. The presentation is lacking, but the world certainly feels large, and it doesn't feel the need to cram everyone into a single story that they don't belong in. It shows that you don't need a cinematic presentation to tell a good story, and you probably shouldn't, actually. Those 2 hours of cutscenes need to be animated fully. Simple events with generic animations or character artwork may not be as satisfying to look at, but they offer greater freedom and breadth of storytelling. Dead or Alive 5 has a character chapter system, but it has an interesting take on it. You play as a character for most of their story role up to a point, and the next chapter will jump back in the timeline to move on to the next character. This can make the story a little harder to follow, but when everything is placed in proper chronological order, it's a lot less contrived than Netherrealm's take. And this was back in 2012, showing how early the cracks were showing in Netherrealm's version. Sadly, not everyone is playable, and Kasumi is given 2 chapters and the bulk of the final one, even if 2 of those are actually a clone. But the climax knows to not limit itself to one character. Hint hint. DOA 6 took a different approach. Here the story is revealed piecemeal, with a few scenes being available at any given time to advance numerous parallel plot lines at the player's discretion. This is a good way to let the player choose if they'd rather stick to one character for a while and get a better grasp on their playstyle, or move over to another location to see how other characters are doing. This time everyone is playable, even the DLC characters, and the climax is once again unrestricted by character chapters. In fact, the player is able to choose one of 3 characters to face the final boss, allowing the ending to parallel the first game or give Hayate and Ayane the revenge they were denied the first time. Choose your own thematically satisfying adventure. Coming back to Arxis, BlazBlue, at least back in the first 2 games, had individual character stories that have very little overlap with other characters' stories, even when those characters actually show up. The stories are told in a visual novel format, utilising character portraits, artwork to depict key dramatic or comedic moments, and overly verbose text narration from the character's internal monologue. The stories also have points where the player is given a choice to decide where the plot goes, often between a serious main narrative or a deviation into dumb anime bullshit. This makes the canonical plot difficult to follow, which is a problem because the story is already a convoluted mess about a time loop, I think. Even when the second game had a condensed retelling of the first to make it easier to follow, it really did not help, and I gave up on the series after that. Persona 4 Arena used the same format, but without the convoluted time loop. The main difference was that the stories would only go up to a certain point until the player unlocked and cleared Labrys' story, at which point the player could then continue. P4A Ultimax instead had 2 alternate narratives focused on the cast of either Persona 3 or 4. Like DOA 6, these stories are divided into parallel plot lines focused on specific characters that unlock bit by bit, which just might be my favourite approach to fighting game story modes. The Guilty Gear Xrd games tell their stories in 2 parts. First come the arcade runs for each character to set up their roles in the larger main story, which is animated much like an anime, mostly characters in basic poses until the action starts and the animation budget kicks in. Strangely, its story mode has no playable fights, instead being just a 4.5-hour movie. On the one hand, I'd prefer a more active experience, but on the other, the lack of a need to include playable fights does grant greater freedom in storytelling, and it can be paced exactly as the writers feel it needs to be, rather than having to interrupt it every now and then so the player doesn't get bored. Not the direction I'd like the whole genre to go, but it's unique and interesting at least. Dragon Ball FighterZ uses the same presentation for its cutscenes, but with playable fights included. The player selects a space on a map to travel to and fight the enemies, and even gets to choose their team for the fight. There are apparently optional clues the player needs to find to advance down the true path, but I've not gotten that far myself. I can confirm, however, that the story has a leveling system, which is fucking cancer in fighting games, let me tell you. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite has a cinematic story mode that sadly falls into most of the same pitfalls as Netherrealm. You only play as heroes, though a wider selection of them. There are very limited opponent options, with only villains, generic troops, and the odd mind-controlled hero being fought. It's structured more like an action game, honestly, with going into a level you won't revisit and fighting a bunch of generic enemies on the way to the unique boss that you'll likewise never see again. The player is always on the left, but there's no attempt at seamless transitions from cutscenes to gameplay, so it's not that big a deal. The real issue is that there is no supplemental story content of any kind, not even arcade endings. This one comes off as the devs being strong-armed into it in order to compete with their contemporaries, rather than having a genuine interest in that style of story. Power Rangers Battle for the Grid uses a combination of lightly animated, fully voiced cutscenes and character portraits with unvoiced dialogue to tell its story. The player is given a character or team for each fight and left to deal with the enemy. Thanks to its small roster, every character is used, including villains and Mastodon sentries. Even the mind-controlled Rangers are playable, which I think is a first. Despite its low budget, the structure of the mode is pretty sound. XMen Next Dimension is an older game from 2002. This one cycles between set characters for certain fights and sections where the player can choose from a list of X-Men to go through the next several fights, including characters that aren't in cutscenes, which would be very useful in our age of DLC editions. And yes, there is a part where you get to beat up the X-Men as the Brotherhood, and the game has gameplay be affected by stories, such as preventing the player from using their super meter as Wolverine after he gets depowered, which we haven't seen from the MK team since Jax threw away his gun in DC. The game has multiple endings based on wins and losses in the finale, but the whole mode has to be played through in one solid run, which is frustrating. Luckily, no other fighting game story ever forced a player to do that again, at least to my knowledge. Tekken 7 is trash. Overall, I think there's a lot Netherrealm. Okay, I'll talk about Tekken 7. While it features more animated cutscenes than SC6, Tekken 7 supplements most of the non-Mishima plot development with comic-style cutscenes with a bland, monotone narration by a reporter who doesn't even get a name and whose voice actor is also the fight announcer, who was specifically directed to speak as flatly as possible. The story only features a handful of characters, with the rest getting only a single matchup each with 2 different outcomes based on which character the player uses, but very little actually happens. And they decided that Akuma from Street Fighter should have a larger canonical role in the story than the vast majority of the actual Tekken characters. Honestly, this and MVCI are the only ones here I'd actually rank below Netherrealm story modes if I was making a tier list. Overall, I think there is a lot Netherrealm can learn from those they've inspired if we all stop giving them undue praise and admit that their story mode is archaic and limits the narrative. For example, MKX introduced Kung Jin, younger cousin of Kung Lao, who idolised his cousin before his corruption into a revenant. Jin feels betrayed by Lao's corruption, and the stage for their clash is very obviously set. Jin's chapter is chapter 4, Lao doesn't show up until chapter 8. Since we can't have Jin be playable after this, and having the two fight in a cutscene would have very little impact, the two keep comedically missing one another, with one leaving right before or right as the other enters. Obviously they intended to save the fight for MK11. MK11 does not feature Kung Jin at all. Their encounter never happened, and thanks to the impending reboot, it never will. If not for the chapter system, we could have had it. Speaking of MK11, Sub-Zero's relationships with Bi-Han, Frost and Sector get no resolution because his chapter was early on, leaving them to disappear or be dealt with by other characters. We never got to see how his cyberization affected his relationship with Smoke back in 2011 either. Liu Kang and Kitana don't get to interact much during the final act of 2011, weakening the impact of their relationship. Same with Cabal and Stryker, who don't even interact after Cabal receives his burns and augments. Supergirl, one of the 3 cover characters of Injustice 2, does nothing of note because her chapter is nothing but filler. If this isn't the ultimate indictment of the chapter system, I don't know what is. But what can Netherrealm do to improve their story modes? 1. Obviously, drop the character chapters. Pick fighters on a fight-by-fight basis, maybe with the occasional player choice. This alone fixes most of the issues. It cuts down on the number of contrived filler fights. It avoids the contrived power boosts characters get. It allows for a wider selection of fighters to be used, thereby preventing them from becoming jobbers and allowing the antagonist to actually come off as threatening. It allows additional fights to be inserted as DLC characters release, thus allowing them to feel like a real part of the narrative. It lets some characters see use in more than 1 or 2 stages, since some chapters are set entirely in one location, or a 2-2 or 3-1 split between 2 locations. And it allows characters to be of use across the whole story instead of in one scene. Imagine how much better the Combat Kid chapters against the Outworlders could have been if we'd played as them all as a group rather than making them all jobbers outside of one encounter each. If you think the player is too incompetent to adjust to using a new character, an issue they will face upon starting a new chapter and when switching back and forth in joint chapters anyway, then just add the option to jump into training mode from the pause menu and then to restart the fight from there. Alternatively, keep the character chapters but divide them into separate stories, or have smaller stories for groups of characters. DOA and Soul Calibur's 6th entries both highlight that trying to make a linear playable movie instead of embracing the unique storytelling options video games offer is one of the biggest poisons to NetherRealm stories. Letting the player experience one character story at a time gives most of the same benefits as removing character chapters entirely, while also letting the player get to grips with one character at a time, but running the risk of spoiling another character's story. Of course, both options can be available in one game, even if the linear chronological version has to be unlocked by completing the individual character stories, or vice versa. 2. Let the player start on the right if you're going for seamless transitions between cutscene and gameplay. This avoids the issue of distractingly obvious choreography in the cutscenes from pulling the player out of the experience. Again, use the transitional zooms to indicate who we're playing as to avoid any confusion. 3. Not vital, but I'd like the cutscenes to be rendered in real time. I get that it would slow the pacing down, but with the company's increasing push towards customization and the potential for DLC costumes and characters, the player really should be allowed to use their customized character in the story mode, and DLC characters can be inserted into the backgrounds of cutscenes or in place of generics. If you plan for it, you could animate the scene with all characters in mind, but leave out models until the character is added. That could add some replay value to the story by letting the player experience it in a new way. It also allows the lighting to be more consistent between cutscenes and gameplay, which is especially noticeable under the red sky in MKX's climax. It also makes the picture quality generally better because it looks like shit at times. And it would make it easier to fix use of the wrong costumes, the wrong gear, and inconsistent designs between gameplay and cutscene. Seriously, Hanzo is dead, he shouldn't be here. Same goes for post-release design changes like with MKX Tanya. Were these scenes rendered in real time, a simple patch could fix it, but having to re-render and patch in a large video file to replace the old one is probably too much effort for them to bother with. And 2 more suggestions that aren't necessarily pulled from other games. 4. Give us multiple times of day for stages. This may sound random, but you may have noticed that the sky changes drastically in 2011 based on where the scene takes place. While it's bright yellow sunlight over Khan's arena, it's overcast purple at the shoreline, pale green in the forest, and a rapidly shifting but often blue sky outside the tower, all at the same time. Likewise, while Superman devastates Metropolis during the day in Injustice 1, his forces are simultaneously attacking Gotham at night. It's quite distracting. Stop it. 5. Let endings be part of the story. I do applaud Netherrealm for not dropping arcade endings entirely like Tekken, MVC and DOA did, but so many of them directly contradict the story mode's narrative that they feel pointless. I would propose that, similar to MK vs DCU, the endings should be canonical and show what happens to the character in the aftermath of the story mode. While hypothetical scenarios can be fun to explore in endings, I think that with so many characters getting nothing to work with in the main story, an effort should be made to let their personal storylines advance in some way in each game. I think that if Netherrealm were to adopt these ideas, even with the god-awful stories the current writing staff keeps spewing out, they'd finally be up to par with most of the rest of the genre and might actually be worthy of some of the praise they receive, instead of just getting by on being a trendsetter that makes shallow action movies to appeal to G.I. Joe fans. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is The Importance of Story in Fighting Games by Just Frame. It's a fairly casual discussion of how fighting games have handled story poorly in recent years, with an emphasis on JF's game of choice, Tekken 7.